The glass doors of the Grand Meridian Hotel slid open, exhaling a gust of lavender-scented air conditioning into the humid city night. A woman stepped inside, her boots making a heavy, rhythmic thud-clack against the pristine marble floor. She didn't look like she belonged in a place that charged $50 for a glass of water. Her name was Anna, though most people back where she came from just called her Chief. She wasn't carrying a designer clutch or wearing a floor-length gown. Instead, she wore a set of camouflage fatigues that had seen better decades, let alone better days. The fabric was faded to a dusty, indeterminate tan. The knees were slightly reinforced with rough stitching, and there was a faint, lingering scent of diesel and dry earth clinging to her. She stopped in the center of the lobby, squinting at the gold leaf signage. Her eyes were tired, framed by thin lines that only comes from squinting at a horizon for too long. She had just stepped off a military transport plane 2 hours ago, followed by a bumpy bus ride and a frantic taxi sprint. She hadn't slept in 36 hours, and her bones felt like they were made of lead. "Can I help you?" a voice drawled. Anna looked up. Standing behind a marble counter was a young man with hair so perfectly gelled it looked like plastic. He was looking at her boots that were scuffed, darkened by old mud, and definitely not meant for a gala. "The Veterans Honor Gala," Anna said, her voice a bit raspy. "It's in the Gold Room, right?" The receptionist flicked his gaze toward a group of men in crisp, tailored tuxedos walking past. "It is, but that's a formal event, ma'am. Strictly black tie or dress blues. You might be looking for the delivery entrance around the back." Anna didn't get angry. She didn't have the energy for it. She just reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled official invitation. "I'm an invitee. I don't have time to change." The man took the paper with 2 fingers, as if it might stain him. He checked the name, then looked at her again, his lip curling just a fraction of an inch. "I see. Well, the Gold Room is upstairs. Just try not to lean against the wallpaper." As Anna headed toward the grand staircase, she could feel the eyes. It was a physical weight. The lobby was filling up with the city's elite donors, local politicians, and high-ranking officers in uniforms that looked like they had been ironed with a laser. She reached the top of the stairs and entered the ballroom. It was a sea of sparkling chandeliers and clinking champagne flutes. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the hum of polite, wealthy conversation. As Anna walked in, a small pocket of silence followed her. It was like a ripple in a pond. People would be laughing, they'd catch a glimpse of her stained sleeve or her frayed collar, and their voices would drop into a whisper. "Is she serious?" A woman in a shimmering red dress whispered to her husband, not nearly as quietly as she thought. "She looks like she just crawled out of a trench. It's a gala, not a campsite." Her husband, a man with a bloated face and a heavy gold watch, chuckled. "Probably some lost soul looking for a free meal. You'd think they'd have better security at these things. It's disrespectful to the actual heroes here." Anna kept her head up, but she tucked her hands into her pockets. She found a corner near a tall decorative fern, hoping to blend into the shadows. She wasn't there for the steak or the accolades. She was there because she had promised a friend she would show up. But the world wouldn't let her stay in the shadows. A group of 3 young officers, all of them wearing pristine dress uniforms with medals that had never seen a speck of dust, drifted toward her. They were led by a tall man with a sharp jawline and a chest full of ribbons. He looked like he had been born in a recruitment poster. "Excuse me," the tall officer said, stepping into her space. He didn't offer a smile. "I'm Captain Vance. We couldn't help but notice your attire." Anna looked at him. His boots were so shiny she could see her own tired reflection in them. "Good evening, Captain." Is it? Vance asked, looking her up and down. His friends chuckled behind him. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a slap in the face to everyone who spent 3 hours getting ready for this night. This is a celebration of the service. Don't you think showing up in rags is a bit beneath the occasion? I didn't have 3 hours, Anna said simply. I had 20 minutes between the tarmac and the taxi. One of the other officers, a shorter man with a smirk, stepped forward. The tarmac? Doing what? Hauling crates? Look, lady, if you're going to pretend to be a soldier, at least buy a uniform that fits. That jacket is 2 sizes too big, and the collar is literally falling apart. It's embarrassing. It's not a costume, Anna said, her voice remaining calm, though a spark of something hard was beginning to light up in her eyes. Then treat it with some respect, Vance snapped, his voice getting louder, drawing the attention of the nearby tables. Look at that patch on your shoulder. It's filthy. You got grease or something on the insignia. If you can't wear the uniform properly, you shouldn't wear it at all. You're making us all look bad. A few of the civilian donors nearby began to nod in agreement. A woman leaned over and said, "He's right. It's about the image. This is a high-class event. You're ruining the photos." Anna looked down at the patch on her right arm. It was a small circular piece of fabric. It was indeed darkened, not by grease, but by high-intensity heat. The edges were charred, and the embroidery was so worn you could barely make out the silver dagger in the wings. To the uninitiated, it looked like a piece of trash. To her, it was the only thing that mattered. "I think you should leave," Vance said, stepping closer, trying to use his height to intimidate her. "Before I call the MP over to check your ID and see if you're even supposed to be wearing that. We don't take kindly to people playing dress-up in work clothes." Anna didn't move. She didn't flinch. "I'm staying. I was invited." "Invited by who?" "The janitorial staff?" Vance mocked. The crowd laughed. It was a cruel, sharp sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Anna felt a flush of heat in her cheeks, not from shame, but from a slow boiling pressure. She had survived mountain passes and desert storms. She had carried men twice her size through fire, and now she was being lectured on respect by a man whose biggest hardship was a long line at the dry cleaners. Just as Vance reached out to grab her arm to lead her toward the exit, the heavy oak doors at the front of the room swung open again. A hush, deeper and more sudden than before, fell over the ballroom. The band stopped playing mid-note. The Brigadier General had arrived. He was a man whose reputation preceded him like a thunderclap, a veteran of 3 wars, and a man known for having zero patience for nonsense. He began to walk down the center aisle, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't looking at the flowers. He wasn't looking at the donors. He was looking for someone. Vance straightened his back, puffing out his chest. "Watch this," he whispered to his friends. "I'll have the general personally kick her out. It'll be the highlight of the night." Vance began to wave his hand, trying to catch the general's eye, pointing directly at the woman in the battle-worn uniform. Vance stood tall, his chin tucked in and his chest pushed out so far his buttons looked like they might pop. He felt a surge of confidence. To him, the general's arrival was the perfect timing. It was a chance to show that he was a protector of the standards. He watched the older man march down the center of the room, the medals on the general's chest clinking softly with every disciplined step. "Sir! General, over here, sir!" Vance called out, his voice cutting through the nervous murmurs of the guests. The general paused. He turned his head slowly, his eyes sharp and gray like flint. He looked at Vance, then at the 2 officers standing behind him. Finally, his gaze landed on the woman standing by the potted fern. Vance took a few steps forward, his smile practically glowing. "General, I am so sorry you have to see this. We were just in the process of removing this individual. She's clearly had too much to drink, or she's lost her way. She's wearing a disgraceful, damaged uniform and refused to leave when asked. I didn't want her presence to ruin your evening or the dignity of this gala." Anna didn't move. She didn't try to hide her scuffed boots or cover the frayed edges of her sleeves. She just stood there, her hands now out of her pockets, hanging loosely at her sides. She looked exhausted, but her eyes never left the general's face. The general didn't say a word to Vance. He didn't even acknowledge the captain's existence. Instead, he started walking. But he wasn't walking toward the stage, and he wasn't walking toward the exit. He was walking straight toward the corner where the shabby woman stood. The crowd pressed back, creating a wide path. The wealthy donors leaned in, whispering among themselves. They expected a scene. They expected the general to dress her down, to demand her rank, and to have her escorted out in handcuffs for impersonating an officer in such a bedraggled state. Vance followed a few steps behind the general, his smirk widening. "See," he whispered to his buddies. "He's going to handle it personally. She's done for." As the general got within 3 feet of Anna, he stopped. The room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the industrial refrigerators in the distant kitchen. The general's face was unreadable, a mask of weathered skin and old scars. He looked at the dust on her shoulders. He looked at the way the fabric was thinned at the elbows. And then his eyes locked onto the small, blackened circle on her right shoulder, the insignia that the others had called grease-stained and filthy. For a long moment, the general just stood there. Then something happened that no one in the room expected. The general's hand, which had led thousands of men and signed high-level treaties, flew up to his brow in a salute so fast and so sharp it made an audible whack against his cap. "My God," the general whispered, his voice cracking just a tiny bit, losing its usual iron edge. "I didn't think you'd actually make it." The room gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sounded like a vacuum. Vance's smirk didn't just fade, it fell off his face. He froze mid-step, his hand still half raised to point at her. "I gave my word, sir," Anna said. Her voice wasn't raspy anymore. It was steady. "The flight was delayed in Germany, and the transport into the city hit heavy traffic. I didn't have time to stop at my quarters." The general lowered his hand, but he didn't relax his posture. He looked at her with a level of respect usually reserved for heads of state. "You didn't have to stop anywhere. You are exactly where you belong, and you are dressed exactly how you should be." He turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder at Vance, who was now trembling. The general's eyes were no longer flinty, they were freezing. "Captain, I believe you were saying something about dignity and standards." Vance swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down like a fishing float. I just thought, sir, the dress code, she looks so... I didn't realize." "You didn't realize?" The general's voice wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the ballroom. It was the kind of voice that made people want to hide. "You didn't realize that the woman you were trying to throw out is the reason you are standing in a heated room with a steak dinner waiting for you. You didn't realize that this ragged uniform has seen more service in the last 6 months than your entire lineage has seen in 60 years. One of the socialites in the red dress stepped back, hiding her champagne glass behind her back as if she were ashamed of it. The silence in the room was now heavy with a different kind of tension-shame. The general turned back to Anna. He reached out and gently touched the blackened patch on her shoulder. "Tell me," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her and the few people standing close. "Is this from the extraction at the ridge?" Anna nodded. "Yes, sir." The heat from the debris was a bit more than the fabric could handle, but the gear held up. "And the others?" the general asked, his eyes searching hers. They're safe, sir. Every single one of them. They're being debriefed now. I was the only one authorized to travel ahead. The general closed his eyes for a second, the look of pure relief crossing his face. He then turned back to the room, addressing the crowd of hundreds. Listen up, all of you. The guests stood like statues. Even the waiters stopped moving. Tonight we are here to honor heroes, the general shouted. We talk a lot about the glory of the service. We look at the medals and the polished brass and the fancy dinners. But this, he gestured toward Anna's dusty, worn-out fatigues. This is what a hero actually looks like. A hero looks tired. A hero looks like they've been dragged through the mud and the fire. A hero doesn't always have time to look pretty for your photos, because a hero is too busy doing the work that keeps you safe while you sleep. He looked directly at Vance. Captain, you are dismissed from this event. Go back to your quarters and write me a 10-page essay on the history of the unit Insignia you just called filthy. If it's not on my desk by 0600, don't bother showing up for duty. Vance didn't say a word. He turned on his heel, his face the color of a beet, and scurried out the side door, his two friends following him like beaten dogs. The general then offered his arm to Anna. Now, if you'll permit me, I'd like to introduce you to some people who have been waiting a long time to meet the woman who saved their sons. Anna hesitated. She looked at the fancy tables and the judgmental faces that were now trying very hard to look welcoming. I'm really underdressed for the head table, sir. The general laughed, a deep, warm sound. Ma'am, in this room you are the only one who is dressed perfectly. Let's go. As they walked toward the front of the room, the whispers started again, but the tone had changed completely. It wasn't mocking anymore. It was filled with awe. But as Anna sat down, she noticed a man at the far end of the table. A man who looked very nervous, clutching a briefcase. He had been watching her since she walked in, and unlike the others, he didn't look impressed. He looked terrified. The general pulled out a chair for Anna at the very center of the long head table. It was a seat reserved for the most important guest of the night, positioned directly under the brightest chandelier. Anna sat down slowly, feeling the plush velvet of the chair against her rough trousers. It felt strange. For the last several months, sitting down usually meant leaning against a cold rock or a vibrating metal bench inside a noisy cargo plane. The table was set with heavy silver forks and crystal glasses that caught the light, creating little rainbows on the tablecloth. Anna felt out of place, but the general wouldn't have it any other way. He sat to her right, ignoring the local politicians who were lining up to shake his hand. Eat something? The general urged, pushing a plate of appetizers toward her. I know what the fruit is like on those transport flights. It's mostly salt and cardboard. Anna managed a small smile. It wasn't even that good this time, sir. The heater broke halfway over the Atlantic. As she took a small piece of bread, she felt that sensation again, the feeling of being watched. But it wasn't the curious stares of the crowd anymore. It was sharper than that. She glanced down the length of the table. Past the city mayor and a wealthy real estate developer sat a man in a sharp gray suit. He had thin hair slicked back and a pair of spectacles that seemed to reflect the light so she couldn't see his eyes clearly. He was clutching a black leather briefcase on his lap instead of leaving it on the floor. Every time Anna looked his way, the man would quickly look down at his water glass or pretend to adjust his tie. He looked like a man sitting on a ticking bomb. Who is that? Anna whispered to the general, nodding subtly toward the man in the gray suit. The general glanced over. That's Thomas. He's the head of the logistics firm that won the contract for the new veteran housing project. He's here to give a speech about his generosity and his commitment to the troops. Why do you ask? Anna didn't answer right away. She recognized that face, but not from a boardroom or a gala. She closed her eyes for a split second, flashing back to a dusty road 3 weeks ago. She remembered a convoy of trucks passing through a checkpoint. She remembered the markings on the crates, the same logo she now saw pinned to the lapel of the man's gray suit. "He looks like he's seen a ghost," Anna muttered. "He probably has," the general replied dryly. "He's been under pressure lately. There have been reports of supplies going missing, medical kits, cold weather gear, the kind of stuff your unit was supposed to receive last month. He claims it was insurgent activity, but my gut tells me someone is lining their pockets." Anna's grip tightened on her napkin. The cold weather gear? She thought about the 3 nights she had spent shivering in a dugout, because the promised heaters and blankets never arrived. She thought about her teammate who had nearly lost 2 toes to frostbite because of missing supplies. The evening moved into the formal program. The mayor stood up and gave a long, rambling speech about bravery, but Anna hardly heard a word. She was watching Thomas. The man was sweating. He kept checking his watch and glancing toward the exit. He looked like he wanted to run, but he was trapped by the protocol of the evening. Finally, the general stood up. The room fell silent instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general began, his voice booming without the need for a microphone, "we are here to talk about service. We are here to honor the best of us. But service isn't just about what happens on the battlefield. It's about the trust we place in those back home to support the ones on the front lines." He paused, his gaze drifting toward Thomas. The man in the gray suit looked like he was about to faint. "When a soldier is out there," the general continued, "they shouldn't have to worry about whether their boots will hold up or if their medical supplies were sold to the highest bidder on the black market. They should be able to focus on the mission." Anna noticed Thomas reach down and slowly try to slide his briefcase under the table, away from view. He was moving an inch at a time, trying to be invisible. The general turned to Anna. "I asked this woman here tonight for a reason. Not just because she is a hero, which she is, but because she was the one on the ground when the supplies the ones Thomas's company was supposed to deliver never showed up." The room went cold. The clinking of silverware stopped. The socialites who had been whispering about Anna's uniform now looked at Thomas with growing suspicion. "Thomas," the general said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet tone, "why don't you come up here? I'm sure you'd love to explain to the chief why her men were freezing while your company's stock price was hitting an all-time high." Thomas stood up, but his legs looked like they were made of jelly. "General, this isn't the time. The paperwork is all in order. I have the manifests right here in my bag. It was a clerical error at the border." "Then bring the bag up here," the general said. "Let's look at those manifests together. I'm sure Anna would love to see them. She's an expert at spotting clerical errors." Thomas didn't move toward the stage. Instead, he took a step backward. His eyes darted toward the side exit, the same one the arrogant captain had used earlier. I have to take this call," Thomas stammered, fumbling with a phone that wasn't ringing. "It's the office. An emergency." He turned and bolted. He didn't just walk fast. He ran, clutching that leather briefcase to his chest, like it was a shield. "Security," the general said calmly into the small microphone on the podium. "Don't let him reach the parking lot." The room was in an uproar. People were standing up, craning their necks to see the chase. Anna didn't move. She just watched the doors through which Thomas had disappeared. She felt a strange sense of calm. The battle in the mountains was over, but it seemed a different kind of war was just beginning right here in this fancy ballroom. The general sat back down next to her, breathing heavily. "I've been waiting for a reason to pin him down," I just needed a witness that no one could argue with. I needed someone who had actually felt the cold. He looked at Anna's worn uniform. I'm sorry you had to deal with that tonight. I brought you here to be honored, and instead, I used you for a trap. Anna looked at the general. For the first time all night, she reached out and put her hand on his arm. Sir, I didn't come here for the dinner. If being here helps catch the man who left my team in the dark, then this is the best mission I've ever been on. But as the general smiled, a young aide rushed up to the table looking pale. He leaned over and whispered something into the general's ear. The general's smile vanished. He looked at Anna, his expression grim. He got to the car, but he didn't go alone. He's got the files, and he's heading for the docks. If he gets on that boat, we lose the evidence for good. Anna stood up. She didn't look tired anymore. The exhaustion that had been weighing her down since she stepped off the plane was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. General, she said, straightening her faded jacket. I don't suppose you have a fast car and a driver who knows how to break a few speed limits. The general stood up with her. I have something better. I have the keys to the city's emergency response unit. And I think it's time we showed these people what that uniform can really do. The general didn't waste another second. He grabbed a heavy black radio from his aide and began barking orders that sounded like poetry to Anna's ears. Within moments, the fancy, quiet atmosphere of the gala was shattered by the distant, rising wail of sirens. The docks are 3 miles south, the general said, looking at Anna. Thomas has a private launch waiting at Pier 42. He's been planning an exit strategy for months, but he didn't count on you showing up tonight to pull the thread on his sweater. They moved through the ballroom, a whirlwind of olive drab and determined energy. The socialites parted like the Red Sea. The woman in the red dress, who had laughed at Anna's boots earlier, now stood pressed against a wall, her mouth hanging open in shock. Anna didn't even see her. She was already mentally calculating the distance and the terrain. They burst through the hotel's front doors. Waiting at the curb was a matte black SUV with its lights flashing. A driver in a crisp uniform held the door open. Anna and the general slid into the back, and the vehicle roared to life before the doors were even fully shut. He thinks he's safe because he has a head start, the general muttered, staring at a tablet screen that showed a pulsing red dot moving toward the water. But he's driving a luxury sedan. He's stuck to the main roads. We don't have to be. He looked at the driver. Take the industrial service road. Cut through the freight yard. The SUV swerved, tires screeching, and dived down a narrow alleyway that smelled of wet pavement and old metal. Anna gripped the handle above the door. The familiar jolt of a fast-moving vehicle over rough ground felt more like home than the velvet chairs of the ballroom ever could. She felt the adrenaline washing away the last of her jet lag. This was a different kind of mission, but the stakes were just as high. If those files in the briefcase disappeared, hundreds of veterans would continue to suffer in silence, while men like Thomas grew fat on the profits of stolen gear. Why would he run? Anna asked, her eyes fixed on the rain-slicked road ahead. He could have lied. He could have hired a dozen lawyers to bury the truth. Because he's a coward, the general replied. Cowards can handle a slow fight in a courtroom. They can't handle being looked in the eye by the person they actually hurt. When he saw that insignia, he knew the game was over. He knew you weren't just a name on a report. You were the consequence. As they neared the waterfront, the skyline grew dark and jagged with the shapes of massive shipping cranes. The red dot on the tablet was nearing the end of the pier. There he is, the driver shouted. Up ahead, a silver Mercedes was weaving through the maze of shipping containers, heading toward a sleek white boat docked at the very end of the concrete pier. Thomas was driving like a madman, clipping the corner of a wooden crate and sending sparks flying into the night air. The SUV gained ground. The gap between them closed from 100 yards to 50, then 30. Thomas reached the edge of the water and slammed on his brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from the drop-off. He scrambled out of the driver's side, clutching the leather briefcase to his chest. He looked frantic, his expensive suit jacket torn and his glasses missing. "Stop him," the general yelled, but Thomas was already halfway down the gangplank of the boat. A motor roared to life, churning the dark harbor water into a white foam. The SUV screeched to a stop behind the abandoned Mercedes. Anna didn't wait for the vehicle to settle. She threw the door open and hit the ground running. Her heavy boots, the ones the captain had called disgraceful, gripped the wet concrete with perfect traction. She didn't feel the weight of her exhaustion. She only felt the rhythm of the chase. "Thomas, drop the bag," she commanded, her voice ringing out over the sound of the boat's engine. Thomas looked back, his face a mask of pure terror. He saw the woman in the battle-worn uniform charging toward him. To him, she didn't look like a shabby veteran anymore. In the flickering light of the docks, she looked like an inevitable force of nature. He reached the deck of the boat and screamed at the pilot to go. The boat began to pull away from the pier, a gap of 3 feet, then 5, then 8 opening up between the wood and the steel. Anna didn't hesitate. She didn't slow down to measure the distance. She reached the edge of the pier and launched herself into the air. For a second, she was suspended over the black, churning water. Then, her boots slammed onto the fiberglass deck of the boat. She rolled, absorbing the impact, and came up on her feet in one fluid motion. Thomas tripped backward over a coiled rope, falling hard onto the deck. The briefcase slid across the floor, stopping right at Anna's feet. The boat's pilot, a rough-looking man in a knit cap, stepped out of the cabin, looking like he was ready for a fight. But then he saw Anna. He saw the look in her eyes, the look of someone who had survived things he couldn't even imagine. He saw the charred insignia on her shoulder. He looked at her, then at the shore where the general and a dozen police officers were now standing, with their lights flashing. The pilot slowly raised his hands. "I'm just the driver, lady. I don't want no trouble." Anna picked up the briefcase. She looked down at Thomas, who was shivering on the deck, sobbing quietly. "It was just business," Thomas whimpered. "Everyone does it. It's just how the system works." "You don't understand how the world works." Anna stepped closer. "You don't understand how the world works." Anna stepped closer, the shadow of her worn cap falling over his face. "I know exactly how the world works, Thomas. It works because people like me do the jobs that people like you are too afraid to even dream about, and it stops working when people like you decide that a new car is worth more than a soldier's life." She turned away from him and walked to the edge of the boat. The pilot had brought the vessel back to the pier. Anna stepped across the gap and onto the solid ground. The general was waiting there. He looked at the briefcase in her hand, then at her. He didn't say anything at first. He just reached out and brushed a bit of dockside grit off her shoulder, right next to the unit patch. "I think," the general said quietly, "that we have everything we need." "What happens now?" Anna asked, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade, leaving her feeling twice as tired as before. The general looked at the police officers taking Thomas into custody. Then he looked back at the Grand Meridian Hotel in the distance, glowing against the night sky. "Now," the general said, "we go back. There's a room full of people who owe you an apology. And I think it's time they heard the rest of the story." Anna looked at the briefcase, then at her scuffed boots. She took a deep breath. "I'd rather just go home, sir." "You will," the general promised. "But first, let's finish the mission. The ride back to the hotel was much quieter than the ride out. The sirens were off, and the only sound was the low hum of the SUV's engine. Anna sat in the back seat, the leather briefcase resting heavily on her lap. She felt the weight of it, not just the physical weight of the papers and the hard drive inside, but the weight of justice. The general looked out the window as the city lights blurred past. "You know," he said softly, "most people in that room tonight will never see a day of real hardship. They think life is a series of appointments and social climbings. They saw your uniform as a failure to meet their standards. They didn't realize your uniform is the standard." Anna looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were scraped from the jump onto the boat. "I just wanted to get through the night without being noticed, sir. I didn't plan on chasing a CEO across a dock." "The best ones never plan for it," the general replied. "They just do it because it needs doing." When the SUV pulled up to the front of the Grand Brigadier for the second time that night, the scene was very different. Word had traveled fast. The guests hadn't gone back to their dinners. Many of them were gathered near the entrance or standing on the balconies, peering down to see what had happened. As Anna stepped out of the vehicle, a hush fell over the crowd. She still looked the same, dusty, tired, and wearing her frayed fatigues. But the way people looked at her had shifted. The judgment was gone, replaced by a tentative, awkward respect. They didn't know whether to clap or stay silent. The general led her back into the gold room. He didn't go to his seat this time. He walked straight to the podium. He placed the briefcase on the lectern with a loud thud that echoed through the speakers. Tonight was supposed to be a night of celebration. The general began, his voice steady and cold. But it became a night of revelation. "We found out that while some people were out there bleeding for this country, others were sitting in rooms just like this one, figuring out how to profit from that blood." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of manifests. "These documents, which Thomas tried to throw into the harbor, prove that the equipment meant for our units, the equipment that would have prevented frostbite and saved lives, was diverted and sold. It was replaced with cheap, substandard gear." A murmur of outrage rippled through the room. The same people who had been nodding along to Thomas's generosity earlier were now whispering in horror. "And the only reason we have this evidence," the general continued, gesturing toward Anna, "is because a woman who was actually there, who felt the cold and saw the consequences, refused to be intimidated. She was mocked when she walked in here. She was told she was a disgrace to the uniform because it wasn't shiny enough, because it looked battle-worn." The general leaned forward, his eyes scanning the faces of the wealthy donors and the young, polished officers. "I want you all to look at her. Really look at her. That wear and tear isn't a lack of discipline. It's a map of her service. Every scuff on those boots is a mile she walked for you. Every fray on that sleeve is a moment she put herself between a threat and your safety. If you find her uniform offensive, then you find the reality of freedom offensive." Anna felt a lump in her throat. She had never been one for speeches. She preferred the quiet camaraderie of her team, where words weren't necessary because everyone knew the stakes. But seeing the faces in the crowd change, seeing them finally understand, brought a strange sense of peace. The general stepped back from the mic. "I don't want your applause tonight. I want your reflection. And more importantly, I want those of you who stood by while she was insulted to think about what kind of honor you are actually celebrating here." He turned to Anna and held out his hand. "Chief, would you like to say anything?" Anna walked up to the podium. She had to adjust the microphone down because it was set for the general's height. She looked out at the sea of tuxedos and gowns. She saw the captain from earlier standing at the very back of the room, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "I didn't come here to be a hero," Anna said simply. Her voice was quiet, but because the room was so silent, it carried to every corner. I came here because I promised a friend I'd be here. My team doesn't do what we do for galas or for plaques on a wall. We do it for each other. She paused, looking at the charred patch on her shoulder. This uniform is tired. I'm tired. But the things we stand for shouldn't be. When you see someone in a uniform that looks a bit rough, don't assume they don't care. Assume they've been busy. She stepped down, and this time the applause wasn't polite or forced. It was a roar. People stood up, not because it was the protocol, but because they felt the weight of her words. As the night finally wound down, the general walked Anna to a private car he had arranged to take her home, not to a barracks, but to her actual house, where her family was waiting. "What will happen to the unit?" Anna asked as she stood by the car door. "With these files?" The general tapped the briefcase. "We're going to clean house. Every contract will be audited. Every penny will be accounted for. And your team is getting the best gear money can buy, starting tomorrow. I'll make sure of it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, polished wooden box. He handed it to her. "I was going to give this to you on stage, but I think you prefer it this way." Anna opened the box. Inside was a new insignia, the same silver dagger and wings, but made of high-grade metal, gleaming and sharp. "Keep it," the general said, "but if you ask me, the one you're wearing is worth a lot more." Anna smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her tired eyes. She tucked the box into her pocket. "Thank you, sir, for everything." "No," the general said, snapping one last salute. "Thank you, Chief." Anna climbed into the car. As they drove away from the hotel, she looked back at the grand building. It was still glowing, still beautiful, and still full of people with expensive lives. But as she leaned her head against the cool glass of the window and finally let her eyes close, she knew she wasn't the outcast anymore. She was the one who had brought the truth into the room. And for the first time in months, she knew she was finally going to get a good night's sleep. The battle-worn uniform would eventually be washed and folded away, but the story of what happened that night would be told in those hallways for years to come. It was the night a shabby set of fatigues outshone every diamond in the room.